Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of DarshanTalks. Today's interview is brought to you by the Kilcarney Law Firm, and today's interview is going to be about marketing and outreach in historically disenfranchised communities. And I got that one wrong a few seconds ago, so I'm going to ask the right way of doing that. But historically disenfranchised communities. So if you are in marketing, if you are in medical affairs as well, so it's just outreach. If you care about today's discussion, you're going to care about what we talk about today. Our guest today is a bit of a superstar. She is a marketing leader, currently leading marketing efforts at Position Squared in the Bay Area. She actually lived in my neighborhood. She worked in the Delaware area. She's a one-woman marketing army and has been involved in digital marketing for 26 years. I really don't mumble as much as I feel like I'm doing right now. She is a creative and a marketer, which to me are magic words because I am neither one of those two things. And I'm always amazed when people have those skill sets. Our guest for today, Taryn Talley. Hey, Taryn, how are you?
Hi, Darshan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Again, just to remind people, please reach out, ask our guest questions. If you like, leave a comment, please subscribe. By hitting the bell icon and share. It helps with the YouTube algorithm. You can always reach me on Twitter, DarshanTalks. Go to my website, DarshanTalks.com. You can reach Taryn at Taryn.Talley1@gmail.com. Turns out there are about 6 different Taryn Talleys on LinkedIn. You can also find her and ask her company for help at PositionSquared.com. On the URL, it's going to be Position2.com. You can also find her on LinkedIn at Taryn-Talley1, on which I believe there are 6 others, like I said. So lots and lots of people, lots of information. But Taryn, thank you so much for coming on. Couple of questions for you just before we get started.
Sure.
We're talking a little bit about the marketing to disenfranchised individuals. So first of all, what's the better way of phrasing that? Because I'm not historically marginalized. That's what you said. Historically marginalized.
Yeah, I mean, I know that sometimes people get wrapped up in language, right? And we have those conversations on platforms, and I try to stay as current as possible. But like for me, I feel like I always felt historically marginalized was a better term, right? Because we're talking about like just that legacy of a couple centuries and just how it's impacted these communities moving forward. So it's kind of like my more of a fave term. I don't know if it's completely
in vogue, if you will, for right now, and that can
what
evolve.
I think is stronger.
So let's talk a little bit about the case for addressing historically marginalized communities. Could you talk a little bit about in numbers? How big is this population?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about historically marginalized communities, I mean, it's people of color, right? These are people that, I'm sure you've seen it on many social platforms, right? Talking about taking down that ableist mindset. So people with disabilities, right? And then we've got the LGBTQ2SIA, like so, the full spectrum, right? But these are typically communities that have not been included, addressed from a product perspective or from a marketing perspective, right?
So
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Were you in the middle of the response? I didn't
No.
realize.
I was just wrapping up. Go ahead.
Okay. No. So you talk a little bit about, for example, people of color. I'm going to ask an ignorant question. Am I a person of color? And the reason I ask that is, as an Asian, or technically Southeast Asian, there are people who will say, yes, you are, because you're a minority in terms of the sheer numbers of it. And then you'll get people who go, no, what we mean is individuals who have economic disadvantages as well, and Asians in general don't tend to have those same economic disadvantages. So how do you play that out?
I mean, for me, like, and I'm just going to be very transparent and set this up straight up. So with the diversity and just how, in terms of diverse every group is, right? I don't really feel like there's one person that's going to stand up here and speak for an entire swath of humans, right? Like it's just impossible. Like I don't even speak for my entire community that in the LGBT space, right? But what I'm going to talk to is my perceptions and how I understand it and how I actually operate in it. So for me, it doesn't, like, I don't look at the economic circumstances of individuals as a kind of a way to demarcate, right, between somebody who's a person of color or not. Because, it's like, looking, I think for me, it's like when I'm addressing or thinking of people of color, I'm thinking of the full like spectrum of everyone, right? Because bigotry and prejudice and racism do not stop when you make X amount of money, or do not stop when you have a white collar job, right? Like these, like, so it continues forward. And as we've seen in the US in the past couple of years, the violence against the Asian American Pacific Islander community is ever present, and it hits everybody anywhere. So I kind of see it as like everybody maybe who's like not European, right, has that kind of experience. And then when we're in the regions that we are from, there's a whole different thing. So like I just look at it as like kind of welcoming everybody in, and just it's kind of how I look at it. So I don't differentiate based on what it means.
So what you're saying is, unfortunately, I can't just go to a person and just get a blessing. So there's no Al Sharpton for me to go talk to and get blessed on whether I constitute a person of color or not. It's going to be a conversation. It's going to be
you identify with the community you're part of, right? Like, yeah. And are you, do you identify with the Asian American community? Like, so for me, I'll give you an example, right? So for me, I'm triracial. And what that means is my heritage from Europeans comes from the 1600s, right? So indentured servants come over, right? They engage with indigenous peoples in trade. I also have African ancestry that comes from the South as well, right? Now, for me, like the community that I've identified the most with and that I've learned part of the language and learned the ceremonies was the indigenous aspect of it, right? Because I never kind of really felt like I fit in the US. I feel like I'm the quintessential American based on our history, but yet I never felt like I fit in. So building and connecting with a mixed group of natives in Delaware actually helped me establish and understand the role of the people, and kind of gave me a community to go around, and like, so for me, when you see me post about indigenous issues, it's from the teachings from the elders, it's from my tribal community, it's from what I've learned from the people, right? It's the community. So it's like, it's more of where the community that I practice out of and the community that I identify with. So for you, is it, Asian American, right? Is it that community? Or I'm not even sure, like, your ancestry, or like, are you, from the subcontinent, right? So it's like, what, is it that part of that community? Like,
yeah,
I think the term would be Desi. I don't know.
Desi, yeah.
Is it part of the Desi community, right? Like, how does that all function, and how do you engage with people through that? Is that part of like your identity?
Which is a great sort of jump off point, but I feel like there are limits to that as well. And I feel like this conversation was supposed to be about marketing, which is interesting. We've gone down this totally other path, but we'll get back to the marketing piece soon. But what I was talking about is how you identify is a core piece. However, there are limits, and I think we've explored the limits in the last few years. Where I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm probably mispronouncing the name. But Rachel Dolezal, I believe, is that the right name? So she can't identify with the community that she never belonged to.
I mean, that's a very unique circumstance, right? I mean, and we've seen some of that even in the indigenous community, where I've read some recent articles about, like, one of my favorite Star Trek programs had somebody who totally faked ancestry.
Which one? Now I want to know which one.
Deep Space Nine. Oh no, I'm sorry, Voyager.
I didn't watch
Voyager with Chakotay. Well,
yes.
It was the person who was consulting on the show actually had no native ancestry or connection to them. So so that is not an uncommon thing. And I mean, I don't stand in judgment of any person, but for me, because I think like what I do on LinkedIn also mirrors on my Instagram, right? So we have conversations in mixed native communities because I'm mixed indigenous, right? And there are some communities that I don't really count because I don't have X blood quantum, or I don't have this, or I don't have a tribal card, right? Like, I'm not a member of this. Like, there are like little lines. what I'm encouraged by, I think, and social media is a large part of that with TikTok and Instagram and LinkedIn. But what I'm encouraged by is a lot more people like me are standing up and being like, you know what? I follow this, I do this, I'm part of this. And I don't care if you put these like lines in the sand where you're like, no, you don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this. We all belong and we're all part of that kind of like our full relations. So, with the Rachel Dolezal, thing, that's a completely separate thing. I've seen that before, and it's still popping up in other spaces, right?
Yeah.
But for me, what I'm loving is that right now, we're seeing a real big push, right, to take everybody in, and to not differentiate and build those walls, but to actually open it up a little bit, open the space up. And I feel like for me that I belong now more than I have ever belonged.
Oh, that's awesome. So let's sort of pull it back to marketing, because I can go down this path for a very, very long time.
I could talk about this for like 18 hours, but yeah.
Exactly. Let's pull it back to pharma, because as I mentioned, the goal, the audience right now is pharma, is talking about outreach, is talking about marketing, talking medical affairs. And you actually have some experience doing some of this outreach work in the pharma communities. Could you talk a little bit about what kind of groups you reached out to in your previous positions?
Are you talking from like a customer perspective or from like
sure.
any? So in pharma, like most of my pharma marketing, right, was focused on the primary pieces, which are consumer marketing in the U.S. and healthcare professional marketing, right,
Sure.
in the U.S. and in Europe. I also did some work in Asia too. So, understanding your audiences and knowing where they are is critical, right? But one of my first challenges that I had as an early marketing manager when I was at AstraZeneca, I was working on a whole bunch of collateral, right, for HCPs and for consumers. And I wanted to start factoring in what I saw as a really up and coming regulation for digital, which was Section 508 for the US government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which talks about, contractors and vendors and people that are part of the government cycle, right? Being able to make their materials accessible to all people. And, I recounted to you earlier before this live stream that, I really wanted to start implementing this, right? Because I really truly believe in leveling the field for all people, right? And not setting up like goals or gatekeeping, to make people jump through hoops. So meeting with a manager who I deeply respected as a human being, and I was talking about doing that accessibility check on the website, and the feedback was, well, I hope my doctor doesn't have X, right? Which I just felt like was like that it misses the point, right? Yeah. Like it's not like we're designing for one person or developing a product or content for one person. It's about being intentionally inclusive, right? Yeah. In both your products creation, your product design, your product marketing, even your general marketing, right? Like I remember being that marketing manager or that creative or that senior designer and having been like, okay, put one person in from this group, one person in from this group, two people from this group, and then that'll be good. Like that's not intentionally inclusive, right? Like dropping in photographs and people in photographs is not how you include them. You include them as part of the conversation. You understand where they're coming from, where their background is, right? And what the challenges that they've been through. And then you market or you design towards that. So I'm a little bit darker, right, than most people. Have you ever gone into a bathroom with an automatic faucet and the thing doesn't work? Like literally, like I'm invisible. Like I used to think, like, am I a ghost, right? Because I'm like, the thing's not even acknowledging I'm standing in front of it.
Right.
That was unfortunately based on design, right? Like there are things that are not factoring in people with different varying hues of their skin color, right? I think people refer to it as the melanated community, which I am a member, but but that's a real thing. That's a flaw, right? Like if we were being intentionally inclusive, like it should be not based on, maybe heat or temperature or infrared that you can't see through some people, but maybe motion, right? Something like that. Like, you've got to be able to wave and do it. It should be able to pick up basic motion, but like, it's something like that I would challenge, right? About how can we be more inclusive? How can we see people where they are, not where we want them to be, you know? And for me, like that was one of my first lessons was at AZ, where I was like, okay, and it made me want to refine my arguments better, right? Because I think there is an argument to still do that kind of thing and still be that inclusive person, right? And be as inclusive as we can be with people.
I love it because you were before your time, and what I mean by that is there's now a cottage industry, which I'm sure you're aware of, but there's now a cottage industry of lawyers who go and sue companies that are not ADA compliant, Americans with Disabilities Act, and I believe Netflix was sued, and a couple of large sort of, I think Amazon was sued as well. I could be wrong, but like large retailers and large providers were sued because they were not ADA compliant. Also, speaking to the same point you were making a few seconds ago, I think that design defect, if you will, for lack of a better term, permeates not just a website, for example, but it's starting to permeate issues like cameras, which can't tell if you've kept your eyes open or eyes closed because it just doesn't know how to deal with melanin. Similarly, you're dealing with AI, and there's a whole discussion on Google, and just as you forget to address marginalized communities, what is the impact of that on decisions that are being made? One of the conversations I had recently was, since marginalized individuals are not included in some databases, one of which I believe was a database on organ transplants. The computer, the AI, thought that they should not get the organ. And that obviously had a deleterious effect. Now, obviously, luckily enough, we're not talking about something as hugely critical as organ transplants, but we're still talking about reaching out, making people feel heard, as would be appropriate in the context of marketing and outreach. So let's sort of take it back a little bit. So Lydia actually has a question. Thanks for being here, Taryn. I have a question. I apologize in advance if it's too personal. If a new client notices you're trans, do you prefer they keep it to themselves versus asking you about
it? So that's a really good question. So for me, I'm like, you can ask me anything if you ask it with respect, right? There are some things, and I've shared this on LinkedIn a few times, but there's some things I don't answer, right? Which is like, have you had surgery? Are you going to have surgery? What have you had done? You know, that kind of stuff. I feel like that's very intrusive. So here's the guidance I would say to anybody who meets me or another trans or non-binary person. What I would say is, like, if you feel comfortable asking, I don't know, your grandma the same question, then ask it, right? And I think that stops a lot of the intrusive stuff, so it's just about treating people with a little bit of respect and dignity, right? When you engage with them. I mean, I'm an open book. Like I will talk to anybody for a long time about anything, right? I don't have anything to hide, but for me, like, I just want respect.
You've obviously never met my grandma. She doesn't like talking about anything. So.
See, exactly, right? Grandma's not going to answer everything.
So let's take it back. So we talk a little bit about outreach. We talked a little bit about how you reached out to consumers and healthcare providers in your previous roles. And then you talked a little bit about historically, I keep going back
marginalized communities.
Thank you. This is historically marginalized communities. And you talked about things like ableism. You talked about people of color. You talked about LGBTQIA+ communities. There's a term that gets thrown around all the time, which I think a lot of people sort of miss, which is this idea of intersectionality. What does that mean, and how do you sort of consider that in the context of appropriate outreach?
I mean, for me, like, one of the hashtags I use, and it's probably not super popular on LinkedIn, but I am intersectional AF. And I think most of us know what the AF means, right?
Yeah.
So I have multiple intersections, right? And it doesn't mean that I'm focused on just one intersection at any given time. You can hit me from multiple perspectives, right? As somebody who's a member of the indigenous community, somebody who's BIPOC, being African and indigenous, somebody who's trans, I'm bi, right? I'm also in my 50s, so it's like, I'm getting into the ages kind of thing. You know what I mean? So like there's all kinds of intersections that I have. So it's like you can approach me at any particular one, right? Like a lot of what you'll see me post and share is coming from a couple different perspectives, right? A couple different intersections of being maybe older, being trans and bi, and being BIPOC, right? Like those are the ones that I'll focus on and share and talk about the journey or the stories that I've had, right? And you can address me through that stuff. I'm thinking about like this week in terms of Indigenous culture and visibility. Representation matters. I think we've all heard that, right?
Yeah.
So this week, one of my favorite shows, that's been done with production staff that is Indigenous, actors that are Indigenous, is Reservation Dogs. Just launched season 2 on Hulu, right? Watched first two episodes, loved it. Tonight, there is a sequel, and everybody's going to roll their eyes because they're like, "Oh my God, this movie is like this thing is 35 years old." There's a new Predator sequel out.
Yep.
It's called Prey, and it was actually done with, once again, production staff, Indigenous production staff, Indigenous talent, and they put the community, the culture, and the language first in this. So yeah, it's a Predator movie. It's about you trying to survive this giant alien that's a big game hunter. But it also is the first movie to be dubbed in Comanche, right? So it's like having that representation is powerful. I don't know, like for me, just being a member of the community and seeing those positive stories and the way the culture is being represented after decades of being represented poorly in the media, it's empowering, and it's encouraging. I don't know if anybody is a huge fan of the CW network, but over the last few years, we've seen shows where a superhero was trans and played by a trans actress, right? Like, there's been like some of the dramas on the CW, with dealing with the LGBTQIA2S community, right? And just addressing some of those things and showing that visibility. And I think that all goes towards what we see trending with a younger generation of where they feel like they don't have to fit into that binary, right? And they can identify themselves and do the work that they need to do to figure out who they are and what their journey is and where they're going. But that representation all pulls for that. If you've ever been on TikTok, there's a huge Indigenous community there, and on Instagram, right? Sharing those stories, sharing the journey, telling you about the culture. I've got one of my favorite influencers. He does the Ojibwe, I think it's the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe word of the day, right? Which is awesome. And he's based up in Minnesota, and he sits down and he does it based on what he's experiencing today. Like, hey, today's a hot day. Let me tell you what this is in our language. Like that kind of visibility and stuff helps with understanding, helps with a cultural spread, right? And then people can kind of maybe reform their opinions and their thoughts.
So a couple of things that, again,
right, that might have gone like off on a little bit of a tangent.
No, totally okay. We love tangents. So, and I apologize to the audience because I feel like we're in some senses doing a little bit of level setting because there's a lot of sort of what do the terms mean and sort of causation, like why this is important right now. And if we're lucky, Taryn will come back and we can have another conversation on how we can do that. But for now, maybe we're just focusing on terms. You used two terms that I kind of want to explore a little bit. You said BIPOC. I've seen that thrown around a lot. What does BIPOC mean? So I know POC is person of color. What is the bi part of it?
Black Indigenous person of color.
I just learned that. Thank you. So, and is that necessarily the same individual, or is it sort of like LGBT, which is all of them are different communities?
Well, no, I mean, I think it's a broader term. I don't know if it's fallen out of favor or not, but I tend to use it because I feel like it's a very accurate description for me.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's other terms like, the one thing that we need to understand as humans is that in every culture, language evolves, right?
Yeah.
So, and we should just be as attuned as possible to it. So like for me, I still use it. I know probably others maybe do not, but it's something that I can identify with and, can associate with.
So one of the pushbacks you get in this context is from typically from cis hetero communities, if you will, is that we're talking about a very, very small number of people. Why do I need to change my entire vocabulary to address something that affects less than 1% of people. I've seen the terms "go woke, go broke" being thrown around. There's an argument that Netflix, which many would say championed the cause of being inclusive, is now tending to take a step back. Yesterday's news, for example, was HBO canceled Batgirl, which was supposed to have a trans individual in a leading role. So my two questions for you is, from a progressive standpoint, do you believe that we've sort of hit a zenith and things are sort of starting to plateau out before society sort of catches up and we need to have another conversation? Or are we in a stage from an outreach perspective where you still have to keep pushing forward and society will catch up at that point?
I mean, I really feel like we still have to keep pushing forward, right? Like we can't, it's been too long, right? To not continue to push forward, right? Because I feel like, I think people oversimplify it on some aspects.
Okay.
And I think we all know, like, the people in our lives, in our families, right, that woke to them is like a 4-letter word, right? That's like a really negative one. I don't use woke so much as, like, for me, I want to be inclusive and I want to see people where they are, right? So I don't think you have to be woke to be respectful or to come to a conversation with respect and understanding and an open mind, right? I've had some people, even psi gay men, right, that have come to me and like, oh my God, why are you changing the language every week? Blah, 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 blah. You're making it hard to be an ally. And I'm like, if you cannot stand that language changes, which it's been doing for centuries, right, then you are not truly an ally. You're using that as an excuse to not support us, right? It's common knowledge. I mean, especially in English, we don't use words from the 1700s anymore, and there's a reason for that. It's evolved, right? We have new words, so like we have to continue to be open-minded, right? And when I say open-minded, open to things that we are not born, bred, and living in, right? Be open to the experiences of others. Listen to them. Understand where they are and where they're coming from, right? Like, it's like, to describe it to you, like one of my mentors in the Native community was like, he's explaining to me that the community I was joining was run by two spirits, right? Now, I never came out to him, and he died before I could come out to him. But when he told me, he said to me, like, listen, he goes, you don't have to like it, but you will damn well respect it, right? And I was like, and I just looked at him and smiled, like, listen, you really don't know who I am, but okay. Like, we'll go from there, right? But that's the thing. It's like, that was the message, was you don't have to like it, but you need to respect it and understand it, that these are where people are coming from, and this is their background and their challenges and stuff like that. I think it's an important lesson. I mean, to me, Little Bear's words could go to anybody, right, who's being challenged in their perceptions of what is, and I hate to use this, but normal, I'm using my air quotes, you know what I mean, or what's acceptable or tolerated.
You use the term two spirits. What does that mean for those people who don't know?
Two spirit is, so I've had a few conversations on LinkedIn about this one too. So it's a term that's kind of a modern term, right? Coming from English, but before colonization happened in the Americas, the indigenous people from like Alaska down to Chile, right, were they had different gender roles, right? So it wasn't just a binary. They had a very rich, deep understanding of gender. So when you think of two-spirit is an encompassing English term, but it's only used to describe people of indigenous or mixed indigenous heritage that identify as part of the LGBTQIA+, right? So it doesn't mean gay, it doesn't mean lesbian, it doesn't mean trans or non-binary. It's an encompassing single term, because in most cases, post-colonization, we lost a lot of the words that we had in our culture to describe these people, these experiences. So two-spirit is the broad term. So if you're not like of the indigenous community and somehow, I would probably refrain from kind of utilizing it. It's not like one of these things where it's for us, by us. It's more like, it's what we have left, right, to describe us.
Okay. We can obviously keep going, but we are very, very past time already, and these conversations can always be so fun. Before we go, a couple of things for people who are listening in. How can people reach you?
Well, feel free to drop me an email. My DMs and LinkedIn are open. So, I mean, please engage with some media, drop a comment on the post. I do actually read them and respond. So, or drop a DM. So, like I said, you can ask me anything. Just let's keep it respectful and, just open.
Perfect.
And transparent.
And last question, any parting words?
No, I just I'd probably say thanks for the opportunity. I mean, I love being able to discuss this, and just I want to be a positive part of the conversation, right? And I'll take any opportunity I can to share with people the journey that I've been through, or my perspective, or like kind of where I can see things going, or where I'm hoping they're going. So any part of that positive conversation, I'm here for it. So I'd be happy to talk to you again. It's been an honor and a privilege to speak with you and y'all today. Thank you.
The honor and privilege has been ours. Thank you again, Taryn. I appreciate it.
Definitely. Have a good day.